Right, so you recall that America's mostly fake victory in the War of 1812 and the subsequent collapse of the Federalist Party ushered in the era of good feelings, which was another way of saying that there was basic agreement on most domestic policies. The American system was a program of economic nationalism built on, 1, federally financed internal improvements like roads and canals, what we would now call infrastructure, 2, tariffs to protect new factories and industries, and 3, a national bank that would replace the first Bank of the United States, whose charter expired in 1811. You'll never guess what we called this second bank, unless you guess that we called it the Second Bank of the United States. The main supporters of this American system were our old friend John C. Calhoun and our new friend Henry Clay. Both were Jeffersonian Republicans, which isn't surprising because that was the only political party, but it's kind of surprising because the American system had nothing to do with the agrarian republic that Jefferson had championed. But whatever, this was the era of good feelings, so we're gonna go with it. By the way, this nationalism also extended to foreign affairs. After Latin America won its independence from Spain, President Monroe made a speech proposing that Europe shouldn't try to retake colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And if they did, we would, do stuff. This so-called Monroe Doctrine also said that the U.S. would stay out of European wars. Ha 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 ha, that is hilarious! But we did live up to the other end of it. You'll remember that when the British came for the Falkland Islands, we were like, this shall not stand! Just kidding, we were like, go ahead. Right, so the last era of good feelings president was John Quincy Adams, who was quite the diplomat and expansionist. He actually wrote the Monroe Doctrine, for instance. But in fact, it turns out that all feelings were not good. There was significant disagreement over 3 main issues. First, many people felt that the federal government shouldn't invest in infrastructure. Like James Madison, who'd initially supported those bills, ended up vetoing one of them that included a big spending increase to finance roads and canals. Now, the roads and canals did get built, but in the end, most of the financing fell to the states. There were also big problems with the Second Bank of the United States, which, is why you cannot visit a branch of it these days, but we'll get to that in a minute. And lastly, there was the perennial issue of slavery. In this case, the problem started, as so many problems do, in Missouri. So in 1819, Missouri had enough people in it to become a state, but despite the fact that there were already more than 10,000 slaves there, a New York congressman named James Talmadge made a motion to prohibit the introduction of further slaves into the proposed state. It took almost 2 years to work out the John C. Calhoun storm that blew up after this. Actually, it took more than that. It took until the end of the Civil War, basically. But in the short run, Missouri was allowed to enter the Union as a slave state, while Maine was carved out of Massachusetts to keep the balance of things. But the Missouri Compromise also said that no state admitted above the 3630 line of latitude would be allowed to have slaves, except, of course, for Missouri itself, which, as you can see, is well above the line. Anyway, this solution to westward expansion worked out magnificently, provided that you enjoy civil wars. So by now you're probably wondering, where does Andrew Jackson fit into all of this? When we last caught up with Jackson, he was winning the Battle of New Orleans shortly after the end of the War of 1812. He continued his bellicose ways, fighting Indians in Florida, although he was not actually authorized to do so, and became so popular from all of his Indian killing that he decided to run for president in 1824. The election of 1824 was very close, and it went to the House, where John Quincy Adams was eventually declared the winner, and Jackson denounced this as a corrupt bargain. So in 1828, Jackson ran a much more negative campaign. One of his campaign slogans was, "Vote for Andrew Jackson, who can fight, not John Quincy Adams, who can write." Jackson's policies defined the new Democratic Party, which had formerly been known as the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. So who were these new Democrats? Well, generally they tended to be lower to middle class men, usually farmers, who were suspicious of the widening gap between the rich and the poor that was one of the results of the market revolution. And they were particularly worried about bankers, merchants, and speculators who seemed to be getting rich without actually producing anything. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. This vision probably would have carried the day, except a new party arose in response to Jackson's election: the Whigs. No, Stan, the Whigs. Yes. The American Whigs took their name from the English Whigs, who were opposed to absolute monarchy. And the American Whigs felt that Andrew Jackson was grabbing so much power for the executive branch that he was turning himself into King Andrew. So the Whigs were big supporters of the American system and its active federal government. Tariffs, infrastructure, etc. Their greatest support was in the Northeast, especially from businessmen and bankers who benefited from those tariffs and the stability provided by a national bank. And they also thought the government should promote moral character, because that was necessary for a person person to act as a truly independent citizen. Let's start with nullification. So in 1828, Congress passed the Tariff of 1828 because they were not yet in the habit of marketing their bills via naming them with funny acronyms. Jackson supported this in spite of the fact that it benefited manufacturers. The tariff raised prices on imported manufactured goods made of wool and iron, which enraged South Carolina because they'd put all their money into slavery and none into industry. So unlike Northerners who could avoid the higher prices by manufacturing sweaters and pants and such at home, South Carolinians would have to pay more. They were so angry at this tariff of abominations that the South Carolina legislature threatened to nullify it. Jackson didn't take kindly to this affront to federal power, but South Carolina persisted, and when Congress passed a new tariff in 1832, one that actually lowered the duties, the Palmetto State's government nullified it. Jackson responded by getting Congress to pass the Force Act, which authorized him to use the Army and Navy to collect taxes. The law provided funds to relocate Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creek, and Seminole Indians from their homes in Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama. In response, these tribes adopted a novel approach and sued the government. And then the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's actions in removing the Cherokees violated their treaties with the federal government and that they had a right to their land. So in 1832, bank leader Nicholas Biddle persuaded Congress to pass a bill extending the life of the Second U.S. Bank for 20 years. Jackson thought that the bank would use its money to oppose his re-election in 1836, so he vetoed that bill.